When people think of ancient gods, their minds often leap straight to the grandeur of Egypt. The towering pyramids, the all-seeing eye of Ra, the jackal-headed Anubis, and the feather of Mahat. These are the deities who dominate textbooks, documentaries, and imaginations. Egypt's pantheon is a parade of cosmic beings, their stories woven into the stones of Luxor and the sands of the Valley of the Kings. But just beyond Egypt's southern border, past the cataracts of the Nile and into the lands scorched by desert sun, another world of gods once reigned. A forgotten world, a divine order born in dark stone temples and watched over by kings just as powerful as those of Egypt. This was the sacred world of Nubia and the kingdom of Kush. While Egyptian gods are household names, the deities of Nubia remain largely unknown. They have been buried, not by sand, but by silence. Who were the Nubian gods? What did they represent, and how were they worshipped by the black pharaohs of Africa's south? Why did these kingdoms, which rivaled Egypt in strength and splendor, vanish from mainstream history? Their temples left to fade into ruins and their myths left unspoken. These questions lie at the heart of one of history's greatest cultural mysteries, a world of lions and incense, oracles and warrior queens, spiritual kingship and cosmic balance. Nubia was more than Egypt's neighbor. It was a civilization with its own identity, its own belief systems, and a royal lineage that once rose up and ruled Egypt itself. The pharaohs of Kush, crowned at Jebel Barkal, born of gods like Apedemak and Sebumeker, were not imitators. They were innovators. They built temples, offered sacrifices, and governed their people with a divine mandate that pulsed with African power. Their gods were not merely Egyptian imports. They were homegrown deities of war, fertility, wealth, and transformation. This is the story that history forgot, or perhaps never wanted to tell. A story of Africa's sacred south, of a people who looked at the Nile not only as a river, but as a path to the divine. A story of gods who deserve to be remembered. And today, their time has come. Long before Nubia was seen through the lens of Egypt's southern border, it was a land of promise in its own right. A wide, fertile strip flanking the Nile, stretching deep into what is now northern Sudan. This was not a barren extension of the Egyptian world, but a cradle of its own civilization. Here, where the river narrows and the cataracts churn against black granite cliffs, early cultures rose with the Nile as their lifeblood. The land was rich in gold, copper, and cattle. But beyond the physical wealth lay something more profound, a deep spiritual reverence for nature, for the river's cycles, and for the powers that shaped them. The people of Nubia saw the world not as something to control, but as something sacred, animated by spirits and overseen by gods whose names were spoken beside fire and stone. The roots of Nubia trace back to the Kerma culture, which flourished as early as 2500 BCE. This was a society marked by sophisticated architecture, advanced agriculture, and a centralized authority ruled by powerful kings. Yet these kings were not merely political figures. They were spiritual symbols, intermediaries between heaven and earth. In Nubian thought, kingship was born not from conquest, but from cosmic appointment. A king was not only the leader of people, but the embodiment of divine will. His strength, his lineage, his right to rule, all came from the gods. This notion of divine kingship would become a cornerstone of Nubian identity, forming the spiritual spine of kingdoms that would later rise under the banners of Kush and Meroe. Early Nubian religion revolved around natural forces. The Nile itself was more than a river. It was a divine artery carrying the breath of the gods. Mountains like Jebel Barkal were considered sacred. cosmic markers believed to house the spirits of ancestors and deities alike. Cattle, so central to life and economy, were also spiritual symbols. Their horns appeared in royal iconography, and sacrifices involving bulls were carried out in honor of divine beings. This reverence for the land and its creatures laid the foundation for a belief system that would later intertwine with Egyptian theology, but never lose its unique African soul. Contrary to the popular narrative, Kushite religion was not a copy of Egyptian belief. It was older than many realize, shaped by the environment and by indigenous customs that existed long before Egypt's shadow reached south. As Egypt grew in influence and later colonized parts of Nubia during the New Kingdom period, the cultures began to merge. But even then, Nubia didn't simply absorb Egyptian ideas. It reinterpreted them, adapted them, and in many ways gave them new life. Gods like Amun, already worshipped in Thebes, were adopted into Nubia with new attributes and deeper meaning. Amun became a central figure in Kushite religion, not as an Egyptian import, but as a powerful African deity with localized rituals and iconography that emphasized strength, mystery, and universal power. This spiritual flexibility reveals a religious system not based on rigid doctrine, but on a living relationship with the divine. The Nubians believed that the gods could dwell in the land, in sacred stones and lion-headed spirits, in the breath of incense rising from the altars of hilltop temples. Their spiritual life was complex, intuitive, and deeply tied to nature and ancestry. It provided not just comfort or fear, but purpose, a framework through which the kings of Kush could understand their place in the cosmos. In the silence of the Nubian desert, temples rose to echo these beliefs, not in mimicry, but in majesty. This was a land where the divine had roots, where gods were born of the mountains, where kings reigned with sacred blood, and where a river carried not just water, but the voice of heaven itself. The spiritual world of ancient Kush was no echo of Egypt. It was a living, breathing cosmos of its own, pulsing with energy and symbolism, rooted in the land, the people, and the distinct Nubian soul. While Egypt's gods have marched confidently through the pages of global mythology, the gods of Kush have remained largely in the shadows. But to the Nubians, especially the mighty kings of Kush, who rose to become pharaohs of Egypt itself, these gods were not silent. They were protectors, creators, warriors, and judges. Their names were whispered in sacred temples carved into the desert hills and spoken over incense and blood on altars of stone. They were gods of black pharaohs, powerful, African, and proud. One of the most iconic and uniquely Nubian deities was Apedemak, the lion-headed god of war. Unlike the Egyptian war gods, who were often portrayed as falcon-headed or armored men, Apedemak was a creature of raw, feral energy. With the body of a man and the head of a roaring lion, he embodied fierce power, protection, and the fiery will of kings. Apedemak was not a borrowed god. He was born in Nubia, sculpted from the heat of the sun and the spirit of the hunt. His temples, such as those at Naka and Musawarat es-Sufra, bear reliefs of this powerful god, standing tall beside Nubian kings, not behind them, but beside them as an equal. Apedemak was more than a war god. He was a symbol of national strength and divine right, representing the kind of power that roars from the heart of Africa itself. Another pillar of the Kushite pantheon was Amun, a god originally associated with Egypt but transformed in Nubian theology. When the Kushites encountered Amun during Egypt's domination of Nubia, they did not reject him. Instead, they reimagined him. In the temples of Jebel Barkal, Amun became more than a Theban deity. He was the god of universal order and kingly legitimacy, the source from which all rulers drew their authority. In Nubian tradition, Amun was hidden in the sacred mountain, his presence manifesting through oracles and divine dreams. Queens and kings alike sought his blessing to legitimize their rule. He was worshipped not just as a foreign god adopted through conquest, but as a localized and intimately powerful being, the African heart of divine kingship. Then there was Apedemak, the god of fertility, rebirth, and protection. Often portrayed with a deeply African aesthetic, robust, stylized, powerful, Apedemak symbolized the life-giving forces that sustained both crops and dynasties. He was a guardian of thresholds, a divine sentry who watched over gateways between the human world and the divine. Statues of Apedemak were placed at temple entrances and palace doors, ensuring that evil spirits and misfortune would not pass through. His role extended beyond the physical. He was also a gatekeeper of fate and fertility, invoked in rituals to ensure healthy children, bountiful harvests, and the smooth succession of kings. Where Egyptian fertility gods like Min were seen through a strict religious lens, Apedemak was a presence in everyday life, a protector of both lineage and land. Deities, another Nubian god, reigned as the deity of incense, trade, and wealth. In a region famous for its aromatic resins and gold-rich lands, Deities' association with prosperity and sacred offerings was profound. He was often shown with a headdress of incense containers, representing both material abundance and spiritual connection. Incense was more than luxury. It was how humans communed with the gods, carrying prayers upward in fragrant smoke. Deities ensured that offerings were received, that wealth flowed, and that trade routes remained open and protected. His power reflected the unique position of Kush, a crossroads of Africa and Egypt, of desert and river, of trade and conquest. Yet the Kushites did not reject Egyptian gods entirely. They blended them, reinterpreted them through a Nubian lens. Gods like Isis, Osiris, and Horus were absorbed into Kushite religion but reshaped to reflect local values and perspectives. Isis, revered for her magic and maternal strength, was celebrated in Nubia as a queen of deep mystery, aligned with Nubian queens who ruled with divine authority. Osiris, god of the afterlife, was honored not just as lord of death but as a symbol of continuity, of dynasties surviving beyond the grave. Horus, the falcon god of kingship, became a patron of black pharaohs who ruled both Nubia and Egypt during the 25th dynasty. But these gods were not merely worshipped as the Egyptians did. Their stories were rewritten, their rituals redesigned, and their meanings rerouted in Nubian soil. This syncretism, the merging of beliefs, was never submission. It was transformation. The Kushites did not see Egyptian gods as superior. They saw them as allies, as brothers of their own pantheon. They infused them with African depth, molded them to serve the ideals of Nubian royalty, and honored them in temples built by black hands in black stone. The result was a pantheon unlike any other, half known, half forgotten, entirely powerful. In this divine gallery of gods, each figure reflects a different truth: the courage to protect, the mystery of the cosmos, the promise of new life, the riches of the land, and the eternal spirit of kingship. These were not myths told for entertainment. They were truths lived by a people who believed that power came not just from swords or crowns, but from the favor of gods who walked with lions, burned with incense, and dreamed in the hills of Kush. The landscape of ancient Nubia was more than terrain. It was a canvas upon which the divine was written. Hills became temples, rivers became altars, and in the quiet heat of the Nubian desert, Massive structures of stone and symbolism rose to honor the gods. These temples were not copies of Egyptian grandeur. They were distinctly Nubian, wild in their design, bold in their meaning, and deeply rooted in the sacred geography of the land. To understand how the gods of Kush were worshipped, one must walk through the towering columns of Naka, trace the animal reliefs at Musawarat es-Sufra, and kneel before the mountain of Jebel Barkal, where the gods were believed to dwell not in the heavens, but in the rock itself. Jebel Barkal, the pure mountain, stood at the heart of Kushite religion. Rising above the Nile like a sentinel, this natural outcrop was not merely sacred because of its height or shape. It was believed to be the home of the god Amun. Its peak, shaped like a serpent's uraeus or the crown of a cobra, was seen as a divine signature. Temples carved into the base of the mountain honored Amun as he was reimagined in Nubia. Powerful, hidden, mysterious. But it wasn't just architecture that gave Jebel Barkal its sacredness. It was the belief that this was a place where the veil between the mortal and the divine was thin, where kings came to commune with their god and seek approval for their rule. Within its sanctuaries, rituals were performed by priests and kings alike, in ceremonies that invoked oracles, sacrifices, and the burning of incense, meant to carry prayers upward through stone and sky. To the east, the temple complex of Naka offered another window into the worship of the gods. This site, constructed during the height of the Meroitic period, stands as a testament to both spiritual devotion and artistic fusion. Here, lions march across temple walls in honor of Apedemak, their images etched with an almost surreal confidence. Reliefs depict kings standing hand in hand with deities receiving breath, power, and eternal life. The Temple of Amun at Naka merges Egyptian styles with African dynamism. Slender columns, zoomorphic gods, and elaborate ceremonial entrances. Offerings were laid at the altars, water was poured in libation, and hymns were chanted in praise of gods who demanded both awe and intimacy. Then there is Musawarat es-Sufra, a sprawling religious complex unlike anything found in Egypt. Its labyrinthine corridors, massive lion statues, and mysterious architectural features suggest a center of learning, pilgrimage, and sacred instruction. It may have served as a healing temple, a training site for priests, or a ceremonial city for grand festivals. Here, animal symbolism reigned supreme. Lions for war, rams for fertility, and snakes for divine wisdom. The very layout of Musawarat speaks to a cosmology of order and flow, where spiritual knowledge moved in stages, each courtyard a step closer to divine truth. Ritual life in Nubia was rich and structured. Oracles played a vital role in political and spiritual decisions. Amun's will, for instance, was revealed through priests who interpreted the god's response during ceremonial processions, where statues would be carried and questions asked aloud. If the statue moved forward or turned, it was understood as divine agreement or rejection. These oracles did not just guide kings, they shaped wars, treaties, and royal successions. Animal symbolism was deeply embedded in ritual. Bulls and rams were sacred, often sacrificed in elaborate ceremonies to honor the gods or sanctify royal coronations. Birds and lions were etched onto temple walls, not merely as art, but as spiritual emblems. In ritual acts, the spilling of blood, the burning of incense, and the wearing of specific animal skin garments transformed the human participants into conduits for divine energy. The priesthood in Kush was powerful and highly organized. Priests and priestesses managed temple wealth, conducted daily offerings, and preserved hymns and rituals in sacred texts, some of which remain undeciphered. In some periods, royal women served as God's wife of Amun, a role of immense authority that blended political and spiritual influence, highlighting how worship and governance were inseparable in Kushite life. For the common people, worship was both communal and personal. Public festivals, sacred processions, and open-air ceremonies allowed individuals to present offerings, seek blessings, and witness divine presence firsthand. Through these practices, the gods of Kush were not distant rulers in a skybound realm. They were present in the mountain, in the temple, in the roaring of lions and the rustle of incense, close enough to touch, fierce enough to shape the world. In the kingdom of Kush, kingship was not merely a political station, it was a divine calling. The rulers of Nubia were not crowned by man alone, but were chosen by the gods themselves, anointed with the sacred duty of maintaining balance between heaven and earth. To wear the double crown of Kush, and in some cases, Egypt, was not simply to wield power, it was to carry the voice of the gods into the world. The Kushite king, or Kor, was the living axis of the cosmos, the bridge between mortal life and the eternal order of the divine. Every act of governance, every decision in war or peace, every ritual sacrifice was not merely statecraft, it was liturgy. The belief in divine kingship was embedded in Kushite ideology from its earliest periods. The king was seen as both human and more than human, born of woman but infused with divine essence, often associated with gods like Amun or Apedemak. He was not just a servant of the gods, he was their chosen vessel. His bloodline was sacred, his body often deified in life, and his spirit destined to join the realm of the ancestors upon death. This belief elevated kingship into the realm of cosmic duty. To rule poorly was not just to fail the people, but to endanger the entire divine order. Coronation was not a mere ceremony, it was a rebirth. At sacred sites like Jebel Barkal, where Amun was believed to reside, the king underwent elaborate rituals to receive divine blessing. He fasted, bathed in sacred water, made offerings, and stood before oracles who interpreted the will of the gods. Only after these rites, and only if Amun approved, could a man become king. The regalia of kingship was heavy with symbolism: the double crown for dominion over Upper and Lower Nubia, and, during some reigns, Egypt, the crook and flail for shepherding and discipline, and lion imagery that spoke of courage, justice, and divine wrath. Each item, gesture, and word during coronation was steeped in theology. The lives of Kushite kings reflected this sacred identity. Pa, the great conqueror of the 25th dynasty, did not invade Egypt merely as a warlord. He came as a religious reformer, a pharaoh chosen by Amun to restore purity to the temples and spiritual order to the two lands. His inscriptions speak less of military triumph and more of moral duty, emphasizing his piety and his obedience to the gods. He prayed, sacrificed, and built temples as acts of devotion, not propaganda. Taharka, his successor and perhaps the most famous of the Black Pharaohs, embodied divine kingship at its height. Ruling both Kush and Egypt, he commissioned grand temples, expanded the influence of Amun, and resisted foreign threats not just with armies but with oracles and offerings. His reign is immortalized in both African stone and biblical scripture, where he is remembered as a mighty king of Ethiopia who defied Assyria. Taharka believed himself to be guided by the gods, and in every victory and hardship, he turned to them for affirmation. Even centuries later, when Egypt no longer bowed to Nubian rule, the legacy of divine kingship remained unbroken. Queens like Amanitore, one of the great Kandakes of Meroe, ruled not in the shadow of men, but in the full light of divine authority. Her image is carved beside gods, receiving life and power, asserting that women too could carry the mantle of heaven. She restored temples, strengthened the priesthood, and governed with an aura of sacred legitimacy that commanded respect from within and beyond her kingdom. The pharaohs of Kush ruled with iron, yes, but that iron was forged in fire lit by the gods. Their palaces were extensions of their temples. Their wars were waged with spiritual clarity. Their deaths were not ends, but transformations. To be king in Kush was to walk among gods, to serve the land not merely as a ruler, but as a conduit of sacred will. It was not a crown they wore, it was a flame. The relationship between Kush and Egypt was one of both reverence and resistance, a spiritual dialogue that unfolded over centuries, written in temples and sealed in stone. The two civilizations were neighbors, sometimes rivals, sometimes kin, bound by the life-giving Nile and by cultural osmosis that blurred the lines between dominance and devotion. Yet beneath this apparent closeness, the kingdom of Kush walked a careful path. It adopted many elements of Egyptian religion, but it never surrendered its soul. Instead, it merged what served, reshaped what conflicted, and preserved what was innately African, protecting a divine identity that was unmistakably its own. The initial waves of Egyptian religious influence came through conquest and colonization. During Egypt's New Kingdom expansion, Nubia was invaded and subjected to cultural Egyptianization. Temples were built, Egyptian deities were installed, and local traditions were suppressed in favor of Nile Valley orthodoxy. But even in these periods of foreign rule, Kushite culture was not erased. It adapted. Gods like Amun, Isis, and Osiris were integrated into the local pantheon, yet they did not remain Egyptian in spirit. Amun, for instance, took on new dimensions in Nubia. While in Thebes he was hidden and remote, in Jebel Barkal he became intensely local, a mountain god, a kingmaker, a presence in the landscape itself. The fusion was not passive, it was active reinterpretation, where borrowed gods were reimagined through the lens of Nubian cosmology. This adaptation extended to ritual and art, where Egyptian motifs were paired with uniquely African expressions. Temples to Amun and Apedemak stood side by side. Kings were depicted wearing Egyptian crowns but flanked by lion-headed gods of Kush. Meroitic art celebrated Horus and Isis, yet did so in local styles. Thick, rounded figures, Africanized features, symbols that told stories in a language Egypt never spoke. The hieroglyphs carved beside these images often included Meroitic script, an undeciphered language that stands as a powerful testament to the Kushite desire for spiritual and cultural autonomy. Even in borrowing, they kept their voice. But the Kushites were not always interested in harmony. There was resistance, subtle but profound, to full assimilation. At times, Kush rejected Egyptian dominance not with weapons, but with the preservation of older beliefs. Apedemak, Sebiu-Mekher, and Daedon, gods with no parallel in Egyptian theology, were elevated in prominence. Their temples were lavish, their rituals complex, their myths central to the identity of the kingdom. These were not reactionary gestures, they were affirmations, a refusal to forget that Nubia had its own gods, long before Egyptian colonists brought theirs south. Kushite rulers also emphasized their own form of divine kingship, rooted in the African soil, not the palaces of Thebes or Memphis. Though they wore the pharaonic titles when ruling Egypt, Kushite kings like Pie and Taharka presented themselves as restorers of divine order, not imitators of Egyptian rule. Their religious texts describe them as chosen by Amun in Nubia, not in Egypt. This spiritual independence gave their reigns legitimacy not only in the eyes of their people, but in the eyes of history. It was not Egypt that made their rule divine. It was the gods of Kush. In later centuries, as Egypt fell under Persian and then Greco-Roman control, the Kushite religious system continued to evolve independently. While Egypt's temples declined, Meroe and Napata thrived. Oracles were still consulted, lion gods still worshipped, and sacred kingship passed through queens and priestesses in ways Egypt had never embraced. The Kandakes of Kush, warrior queens and priestesses, upheld a matriarchal presence that Egypt's male-dominated priesthood would never allow. Even the dead were buried in pyramids, smaller and steeper than their Egyptian counterparts, but rich in symbolism and distinctly Kushite in design. Through all these changes, one truth remained. The people of Kush refused to become a spiritual colony. They honored what inspired them, reshaped what they adopted, and kept alive the divine pulse of their own traditions. In doing so, they crafted a civilization that was not simply Egyptian in black skin, but an African kingdom with its own gods, its own power, and its own voice. A voice that still whispers from the stones of temples, long buried but never silenced. The twilight of Kush and its successor Meroe did not come with a single blow, but through a long and steady erosion of power, trade, and influence. By the 4th century CE, the once great cities of the Nile's southern curve had begun to fade. Trade routes shifted westward and northward. External pressures mounted from expanding powers like Axum to the southeast. Climate change, economic decline, and over-exploitation of resources slowly weakened the kingdom from within. And with the collapse of political authority, the temples quieted, the rituals waned, and the gods of Kush, once worshipped with incense and oracles, began to fade into silence. But the fall of Meroe did not mean the death of its gods. Though no longer venerated in grand temples, they lived on in other forms, not as ruins but as echoes. The sacred architecture of Naka and Musawarat es-Sufra still stood, half buried in sand but still radiating symbolic meaning, and in the stories of local people, in patterns woven into cloth, in the rhythms of songs and ceremonies passed down for generations, something of the divine lingered. The lion god Apedemak may no longer have been carved in stone by royal command, but lions continued to appear in the oral lore of Sudanese tribes. The reverence for sacred rivers, fertility spirits, and ancestral wisdom endured, evolving into spiritual systems no longer centralized by kings, but rooted in community. Even today, traces of Nubian spirituality persist in African religious traditions that emphasize harmony with nature, the sacred role of ancestors, and the idea of divine kingship. In modern Nubian communities, rituals surrounding birth, death, and marriage still reflect ancient cosmologies. Spirit mediums, divination practices, and reverence for natural landmarks show clear links to practices once enshrined in the temples of Kush. Scholars and archaeologists continue to unearth fragments, texts, statues, reliefs that bring the gods back into focus, and with each rediscovery, the narrative shifts, revealing that Kush was not a shadow of Egypt, but a source of spiritual innovation in its own right. The gods of Kush were never truly forgotten. They survived not just in stone, but in spirit. And in the modern reclamation of African heritage, they rise again, not as myths, but as memories awakening in the soul of a continent. For far too long, the gods of Nubia have stood in silence, buried not only beneath the sands of Sudan, but beneath the weight of historical erasure. Overshadowed by the towering legacy of Egypt, They were dismissed as imitations or forgotten as mere footnotes to a grander tale. But the truth is far more powerful, far more sacred. These were not echoes, these were voices, full and fierce, that once spoke across the Nile, across the savannah, and into the hearts of kings and queens, who ruled not only with might, but with divine purpose. The gods of Kush were born from African soil, shaped by African minds, and carried by African people. And though their temples may crumble, their memory endures. Today we are witnessing their resurrection, not as an academic curiosity, but as a spiritual reclamation. Across Africa and its diaspora, more people are asking questions that reach deeper than textbooks. Who are our forgotten gods? Where are the roots of our divine heritage? What empires did we build? What temples did we raise? What names did we once chant beneath the stars? As archaeology advances and oral traditions are re-examined with care, Nubia's sacred legacy reemerges, not as a relic of the past, but as a cornerstone of African identity. It challenges the narrative that greatness came only from Egypt or only from outside Africa. Nubia tells us we had gods too, fierce, wise, benevolent, and bold. If this story moved you, if it awakened your curiosity, your pride, or your hunger to learn more, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to the channel, share this story. Join a growing movement to remember the gods, the kings, and the sacred power of Nubia. Their story is not over. It's only just being heard again.